Hello, everyone who's already here. Welcome back to Palaezoic. I hope you all had a very happy start to 2026. And very happy that you remembered that we are still here, even though we skipped a week. So yeah, I think that's everyone for now. So I'm just going to start with the introduction of today's speaker. So today we're going to listen to a talk by Alessandro Carniti from Nanjing University in China. His talk is titled Brachiopods in Late Palaeozoic Reefs, Much More Than Boring Dwellers. So the format of today's seminar, if you've forgotten, it was 1 year ago, let's put it like that. We'll start with some welcome and announcements that I'm doing right now. And then we have Alessandro's talk, which will last around 30 minutes, followed by a moderate Q&A of around 10 minutes. And during the entire talk, if there's any issues or questions, you can send them to the questions at Palaezoic's host, which today is Ahana. And after that, despite the large difference in the time zone, Alessandro has decided to stay for tea time. So if you just want to chat with him informally or have some very specific questions that you couldn't ask during the talk, then please stick around till after the talk. Then before we start, a little bit more Palaezoic's housekeeping. So Palaezoic values the participation of all folks who are interested in the paleosciences. So please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar, which you should have read and signed if you joined via this link. Also, please mute yourself during the duration of the talk out of respect to our speaker. You should be muted anyway, but if you find yourself unmuted, please mute yourself again. As I already said, you can ask questions by chatting to the questions at Palaezoic's host. This also goes for the Q&A, so especially if you want to ask an anonymous question, you can first send them to the questions at Palaezoic's host. And if you want to ask the question yourself, you can also use the raise hand function or just put it in the chat. Then we have closed captions built into Zoom, and you can use the CC button to either show or to hide them. Finally, Palaezoic only exists because we have so many cool early career researchers that are willing to give a talk. If you are one of those early career researchers, or you know someone with has a really cool story, please nominate them in this link here. It will be dropped in the chat. And as I already said, we very much welcome self-nominations. And we also would really appreciate it if you could fill out our weekly feedback form. This is just for demographic information so that we can potentially improve Palaeoic. This is anonymous and completely optional, but we really encourage it. And this will also be dropped in the chat window. So that was everything about Palaeoic. Let's just now talk a bit about the speaker today, Alessandro Carniti. So Alessandro did his bachelor's in earth sciences at the University of Milan in Italy, where he also continued to do a master's followed by a PhD. And currently he is doing a postdoc at Nanjing University in China. And with that, I would like to invite you, Alessandro, to share your screen and start your talk.
Yes, sure. So, today, I'm going to talk about brachiopods in late Paleozoic reefs. And this is a huge part of my research, which has been developed since my master's degree at the University of Milan, and it continued during my PhD, also at the University of Milan in Italy. Lately, I moved in Nanjing University in China. I'm also continuing to work on this topic, but more generally now I'm working on late Paleozoic, Carboniferous, Permian brachiopods, not only on taxonomy, but also on their paleoecology, geochemistry, and I'm also working on AI application to paleontological taxonomy more in general. So a lot of different topics. I'm happy to talk about all of this either later or if you want to drop me an email. But today we will mostly talk about Paleozoic reefs. So first of all, reef. When we hear the word reef, most of us will mostly think of something like that. This is a reef barrier in the Cayman Islands, which is formed, of course, by the growing of corals on top of each other to form a huge barrier, a huge build-up, with a lot of then cavities, which are colonized by a number of organisms. Originally, the reef concept was just that, big coral reefs in modern tropical seas. Of course, after the exploration and investigation of extant marine ecosystems and of the geological record, scientists recognized that a number of different bioconstructions built by varied communities, not just with corals, exist also either today or in the past. So we have build-ups built by calcareous algae or build-ups built by microbialites, so built by the precipitation of carbonate crystals and carbonate mud mediated by the presence and activity of microbial nets on the seafloor. So scientists in the early 21st century has extended now the reef concept to encompass all of the bioconstructions built by metazoan and microbial sessile benthic community on the seafloor. And by using this very wide and broad definition of reef, we can include in the same broad category a number of bioconstruction in the entire geological record. As you can see in this scheme, we can consider reef even the bioconstructions in the Archean, built mostly by microbialites. And of course, what we know, so coral reefs are just mostly occurring in recent times after the Cretaceous and in some parts of the Mesozoic, while in other times different communities dominated by stomatoporoids, which are calcareous sponges, or bryozoans, or other kinds of organisms such as rudists, have built different kinds of reefs. All of these build-ups are, however, built by communities which are built in a similar way and which can be classified into categories, guilds, based on the role of the organisms in relation to the growth of the bioconstruction. In particular, we have guilds who have a building role. So we have the constructors, such as corals or stomatoporoids, actively growing and thus building the bioconstructions. We have encrusting organisms, such as the microbialites or bryozoans, which encrust the surface of the reef and thus also enhance its growth. We have the bafflers, such as the crinoids, these echinoderms with a long stem and arms, which are not rigid, but still they baffle sediment and they can thus enhance the growth of the build-up. Then we have the destroyers. Sorry, there is a missing one. The destroyers, so basically the bioeroders, which drill little holes, little cavities inside the reef, which of course have not a building role, but still they contribute to the structure of the reef because they contribute to its internal structure and to the creation of cavities which are fundamental to the ecosystem. On the other hand, there are the dwellers. The dwellers are a number of organisms in the reef ecosystem, which of course are very important from the ecological point of view. But from the sedimentological point of view, from the point of view of reef growth, they are considered as playing no role. And brachiopods, which are the invertebrates I study, are usually dwellers. So what's the problems of being a dweller in the geological record? Well, the problem is that most people studying reefs in the geological record, so most paleontologists studying reefs, do not really focus on the dwellers. So they just study the constructors, the corals, the stomatoporoids, and they overlook the role of other organisms. But I will show you that this might be a problem because this might mean we are overlooking a very important part not only of the ecology of the reefs, but also the sedimentological history. So just a very brief introduction on brachiopods. Brachiopods are marine, benthic, sessile invertebrates characterized by a bivalved shell into which we found a number of internal structures and organs. In particular, the most important one is the lophophore, a ciliated organ fundamental for respiration and for feeding because it acts as a filter for food particles by filtering the currents moving through the shell. These kind of invertebrates were very, very important in Paleozoic seas, whereas now they're much less important and after the Permian. They were much diversified in Paleozoic seas as they were sessile benthic organisms. They had a number of different lifestyles depending on the substratum of the seafloor. So there were concavo-convex semi-faunal brachiopods adapted to live on soft, muddy substrates with part of their body into the substrate and a lot of spines to sustain them in these substrates. There were pedicle-attached brachiopods, usually biconvex, with this root, this muscle going out of the umbo, attaching to the substrate, and there brachiopods which were just free living, so lying on the floor, maybe with adaptation to increase the surface volume ratio, so usually maybe with a large shell, but not much thick. So what about brachiopods in reefs? Well, brachiopods originated in the Cambrian as well as, of course, reef with metazoans. So it's not surprising that brachiopods were common dwellers since the Cambrian in reefs. But however, in Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian and Devonian, for what we know for now, brachiopods seem to not play a very important role. They just are dwellers, and mostly they are represented by pedicle-attached biconvex brachiopods, and there are no specialized forms. So there are no brachiopods which are specialized and endemic to the reef environment. However, more recent research have shown that this changes dramatically after the end Devonian extinction, so in the Mississippian, which is the period which I mostly study. So I will show you two case studies from reefs in the Mississippian. The first case study regards brachiopods in Krakoean reefs in the Upper Visean, so the middle stage of the Mississippian, in particular the Asbian substage in Yorkshire in UK. This brachiopod fauna is very important, very famous in brachiopodology, and has been studied by professionals in the British Geological Survey and Natural History Museum of London in the 80s and the 90s. So in particular, Dr. Mundy and Dr. Brunton. Lately, I am participating in a project to review these faunas. We are reviewing a lot because there is still a lot to do, also in collaboration with the Natural History Museum of London and Dr. Mundy. So, Krakoean reefs actually are a belt of Mississippian reefs occurring at the south of the Ass Creek block, and in particular forming a rim at the very breaking slope of the carbonate platform of Mississippian age. At the breaking slope, we can find this decameter scale bank formed by a skeletal wakestone with brachiopods, bryozoans, some corals, and crinoids, and of course, micrites, so carbonate mud. But this bank, which is deposited around wave base, then passes to a shallower facies, which is a reef framework facies built by a consortium of microbialite, so stromatolite, bryozoan, sponges, corals, and some brachiopods, which is a very interesting fauna which I will go to show you. And then there are flank beds on the slope side, which are skeletal packstone to wakestone with brachiopods, crinoids, bryozoans, and other organisms. These are examples from Derbyshire. As you can see, these belts can be prominent even in today's landscapes because similar reefs of the same age can also occur in Derbyshire and Belgium with similar faunas, but I will focus on Yorkshire because the best examples occur in Yorkshire. So this is a detail of the lithofacies. As you can see in the framework, we have microbialites, so microbial laminae influenced by the presence of microbial mats. And then we have other areas with corals encrusted by bryozoans, so forming a very hard substrate, a true framework, even in the modern sense, comparing to modern coral reefs. So what about the brachiopods? Well, brachiopods are very, very abundant in this fauna, in these reefs. Studies, also including our recent revision, have shown that there are up to 193 species, representing 11 orders in the entire belt of these reefs. But in particular, the taxonomic study of the framework fauna has shown the presence of little productives, so little concavo-convex brachiopods, characterized by specialized morphology for hard substrates, which cannot be found outside of a reef environment, so it's an endemic fauna. So these species show umbo attachment shown by a cicatrix, so a truncation of the umbo, of the posterior part of the brachiopod, which is an indication of direct cementation of the brachiopod to shelly objects, such as the case of this Sinuatella. Also, Sinuatella and other species show clasping spines, so spines starting from the posterior part of the shell and then growing to go around crinoid stems and other objects to clasp and so to cement the brachiopod to these hard shell fragments. And finally, a very prominent adaptation to hard substrates is represented by brachiopods of the genus Limbifera, which has creeping spines, and other brachiopods also has this kind of spines, which grow from the posterior margin and grow on the surface, on the hard substrates, cementing themselves and then the brachiopod to the substrate. And apart from brachiopods, there are also cemented bivalves. So all of these form a consortium of brachiopods and bivalves, which actively contribute to the building of the framework. So they can be considered by the attachment of their shell through spines and direct cementation as secondary constructors of the framework, not just dwellers. But of course, this is a detail which can be revealed just by the careful taxonomic study and careful analysis of the morphology of these brachiopods. Of course, other groups of brachiopods in these reefs, such as concavo-convex productides and pedicle-attached rhynchonellates, are just dwellers in the common sense. So they just exist there, then they die, and then their shell remain on the reef. So now, the work we are doing now is also focusing on the other features of these reefs, so not the framework, but the bank and flank features. In particular, these features do not form a framework, but they mostly consist of a wakestone, packstone with shells and crinoids and some corals, but still, the taxonomic study of these brachiopods has revealed that also in this case, the reef brachiopod fauna shows some endemic specialized form. A very nice example is represented by this form, which is called Productus arquarius. Actually, we are renaming it, but I can show the new name now. And this brachiopod is characterized by a cincture, so an external furrow, which is very characteristic, subdividing the posterior portion of the shell to the anterior part of the shell, the anterior extension, the trail, and by this very peculiar girdo around the anterior margin, this gutter, which you can see prominently here in the section. So this peculiar morphology, we think, was an adaptation to the high energy of the environment with particles in the current, because this morphology would result in a sheltered anterior gape of the visceral cavity, so stopping particles to get into the visceral cavity. But also we think that this morphology might have increased the pressure gradient in the shell cavity, thus enhancing the flow of water and thus the flow of food particles and then waste outside of the visceral cavity. So it would be a competitive advantage in the competitive and probably oligotrophic environment of these reefs. Another peculiar morphology is represented by other species and genera in the reef, which, like Undaria and Proboscidella, Undaria occurs in the bank facies, Proboscidella occurs in the framework facies, but both show this narrowing at the end of the trail, which is probably also an adaptation to reef environment, because this morphology might also result in an increasing pressure gradient between the posterior margin and anterior margin of the shell, and thus increasing water flow with more food particle coming in and waste coming out. So adaptations to the reef environment, even in the bank, and forms such as these tubiform brachiopods, which never occur outside of reef environments. This is the Mississippian case, but it is very interesting that also similar faunas, of course not with the same species and genera, but with similar morphologies of brachiopods of similar, of same families, occur in the Pennsylvanian of Spain, Canada, Permian, Russia, sorry, and in the middle Permian of USA, where the very beautiful and famous silicified brachiopods from the Glass Mountain and Cathedral Mountain of Texas and Oregon show a number of adaptations to hard substrates, including cementation of the shell, cementation of their spines, but also very more specialized forms than the Mississippian, including this aberrant Rictophaenoidea, which has a conical shaped ventral valve, a dorsal valve forming an operculum, and so they actively form a framework in the end, and they have, as you see, a morphology which is similar to that of solitary corals and rudist in the Cretaceous. So this is a form of very, very high specialization to the reef environment. So as you can see, brachiopods can show in the Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and Permian a number of adaptations to reef environment, and there can be a number of endemic forms to reefs. But this is regarding reef in shallow water platform settings. What about deeper water settings? Then this is the case of my second case study, which regards brachiopods in mud mounds from uppermost Visean, Brigantian of Derbyshire. The Brigantian is the substage immediately afterwards the Asbian. So these mud mounds are little younger than the reefs I've shown before. Derbyshire is little to the south of Yorkshire. These mounds occur at the very top of the platform succession in a number of localities, all in settings which are below water base, in outer platform and intra-platform basin setting, so in deeper water settings. They are different from the Krakowian reefs because they do not show any framework built by corals or any other organism. They do not have any coral. They have a lensoid shape. They are not at the edge of any platform. And they have a core which is dominated by fine-grained carbonate material, so carbonate mud, in which we can find a lot of brachiopods, bryozoans, and crinoids. And then there are beds of skeletal paxton, wakestone at the base, and inclined beds around the core. So as these build-ups are dominated by micrite, but do not have any framework, they cannot consider it frame reef, but still they are mud mounds and they are part of the reef spectrum in the broadest sense, because they still are carbonate bioconstructions built through the influence of a sessile benthic community on the seafloor. The question is how this community work in order and influence the growth of these build-ups. So the paleontological study I did during my PhD revealed a very abundant and diverse brachiopod fauna with a very high diversity, up to 45 species. Of course, nothing in comparison to the very high diversity of the Asbian reefs with more than 100 species, but still a very high diversity with different orders. These are the terebratolids, these are the spiriferids, these are the rinconellids. These are the concavo-convex productides. And so, as you can see in this field photographs, brachiopods are very, very common in the core. And all of these protuberance you see here are actually silicified parts of brachiopod shells, while here this rubbly appearance of the outcrop is represented by brachiopods, which are more or less protruding. And as you can see, even in thin section, you can see the presence of cavities, which actually are represented by little biconvex brachiopods. So brachiopods are diverse, brachiopods are abundant. In particular, the brachiopod fauna is dominated in biovolume by the concavo-convex productides, spinose productides, which means that they were more abundant in terms of specimens, but also they were reaching the larger dimensions in the fauna. And then the fauna had a number of bryozoans, crinoids, sponge spicules representing silicio-sponges, which then decayed, and of course, the micrite. So it is important, and we are doing now, to focus also on the study of the micrite to understand who is responsible for the growth of these buildups. In particular, we are collaborating with some people in Italy and the University of Calabria to compare the micrite textures in our buildup, in the buildup in Derbyshire, in the Mississippian of Derbyshire, with the one in extant buildups formed by calcareous algae on the seafloor of extant Mediterranean Sea. Of course, these buildups are completely different in terms of communities, environments, and dimensions, but the textures of the micrite are similar, and so we interpret them as derivative from similar processes. So, as you can see, we have micrites which have a lot of little skeletal debris and which has morphologies which these skeletal grains are aligned into circles, into whorls, which are indicative of bioturbation. These characters are also occurring in the extant micrites, in the coralligenous buildups, which occur from the breakup of metazoan skeletons and the reworking by currents of this fine-grained carbonate material, which is then baffled by the metazoan community in the buildup. On the other hand, other micrite types, in particular the micropeloidal micrites in intraskeletal cavities or homogeneous micrite with cavities filled by cement, which represent siliceous spicules of sponges, which has been substituted by cement, by calcite cement during diagenesis, correspond to micrite which come from the in situ precipitation of micrite mediated by microbial mats and communities in relation to siliceous decaying sponges into the mud mound, as in the modern example. So what's the point in the end? Well, our quantitative estimate of these two micrite types is revealing that the detrital micrite is much more important in terms of volume than the in situ precipitated micrite. What does that mean? Well, it means that the role played by microbial mats and the siliceous sponges decaying tissues was limited in this case in sustaining the growth of mud mounds. So they were not precipitating a lot of material, these processes. So we should conclude that actually a major role in sustaining the growth of these buildups was played by the bryozoan and the brachiopods. Here you have some fenestellid bryozoans which co-occur with brachiopods. So the abundance of the shells and fronts of these organisms was baffling the mud, was sustaining the mud, in particular the spines of the brachiopods was likely sustaining the mud, and the accumulation of the shells was actively stabilizing the buildup and sustaining its vertical and lateral growth. So in this specific case, of course, brachiopods and bryozoans were not forming a proper framework, but still they were contributing actively to the growth of the mud mounds, so these deep water buildups, deep water reef in the broadest sense. So what I've shown you is that brachiopods had a very important history of relationship with Palaeozoic reef. They are just dwellers, non-specialized and with no endemic forms in the Cambrian to Devonian reefs, at least for what we now know, but probably more investigation on these brachiopods in these reefs should be done. Then in the Visean, we have the first occurrences of specialized forms, either specialized to shallow water environments where they adapted to the hard substrates of framework built by corals and sponges, or they adapted to the oligotrophic setting and high energy setting of nearby environment to the framework. On the other hand, other communities colonized deeper water bioconstructions and actively contributed to their growth. So in this case, they had a very important role. They were just not dwellers, not just a part to overlook. And then in the Pennsylvanian and Permian, we have a lot, at least in the Western Tethys realm, of a highly specialized form actually actively contributing even to the reef framework. So, absolutely not just dwellers, and even if when they are dwellers, they can still contribute actively to the growth of the buildup. So what is the take-home message of this talk, which is mostly rooted on my PhD and the work which has then come afterwards? Well, never overlook a component of a marine and possibly any fossil ecosystem. Because any component should be carefully studied, but especially careful taxonomic work is always needed, because without a careful taxonomic work, the little details of the morphology can never be disclosed. So the morphological adaptation cannot be interpreted, and the role of each of the communities in the reef environment cannot be disclosed. So we might be over-interpreting the role played by some organisms, maybe corals, which we commonly interpret as the most important, while we overlook the role of other organisms. So this is the end of my talk. I just take a couple more minutes for some little advertisement before the Q&A session, because I am a referee of the Paleontologist in Progress group, which is an Italian group inside the Italian Paleontological Society, especially for young paleontology students, PhD students, early career researchers, and people engaged in paleontology outside of academia, including paleoartists. We are very active in the Italian community, but we are now seeking also to connect more outside of our country. We have annual workshop at the meeting of the Italian Paleontological Society, but we also have a biannual paleoart exhibition showcasing the scene of the Italian paleoart, which I should say is quite active lately. We are engaged in science communication with a very active Instagram page, which I invite you all to follow. You can find us on Instagram. We have contents regarding communication, regarding the Italian paleontological heritage, the European paleontological heritage, more in general, paleo art, museums, and more in general, news about our activities. We have our own webinar series on YouTube, on the YouTube channel of the Italian Paleontological Society. Of course, our contents are mostly in Italian, but now, especially on Instagram, you can translate automatically everything we post, and we will probably also do contents in English in the near future. So in the webinar, we show what young researchers from Italy do, and I think it's very interesting. And finally, I invite you all to participate to the Paleo 4 Alps meeting in Bolzano, in Northeast Italy, which will be a meeting, a joint meeting of the Italian Paleontological Society, the German Paleontological Society, the Austrian and Swiss Paleontological Societies. So a European level meeting, which of course will be held in English, so anyone can participate, which will be open to any field of paleontology. And our group, Paleontologists in Progress, will be first in line to organize activities for young people and young attendees regarding the use of AI in paleontology, the problems of having a career in paleontology, and we will have a special area and attention for paleo art, as always. So I thank you all for your attention, and thank you all for attending this meeting, this webinar, which was not on dinosaurs or whatever, but on invertebrates. But I think I showed you that they can be fun as well. And this is a little bibliography, which you can check to see if I said anything correct.
Thank you so much for the talk, Alessandro. That was super interesting. And also thank you for the final slides. Always nice to see that there's a lot of opportunities for young paleontologists in Italy and abroad. Yeah, so let's just start the Q&A. I see that there's already a few questions in the chat, so let's start with those. First one asks, I'm sorry, I can't read the Cyrillic name, but it asks, hi Alessandro, have you encountered brachiopods of the genus Davidsonina of the Spiriferidina in the reef deposits of the Upper Visayan in England? If so, what mode of attachment might have been used? I've encountered Davidsonina in mono communities with corals lacking productives.
Yeah, Davidsonina don't occur in the mud mounds, but actually occur in the in these reefs, in these Asbian reefs. So I'm not surprised that it can occur also in other environments in relation to corals. And actually, this is something very interesting because this community of Asbian brachiopods occurring all together in these reefs never occur outside of these reefs, but some specific forms sometimes can occur in relation to isolated patches of crinoids and corals, because probably they have adaptations to the substrate formed by these organisms. So that's why much more investigation is needed, because some areas have a lot of brachiopod faunas, but details of the taxonomy of these brachiopods is not very clear. So maybe some genera have been completely overlooked. So the presence of some genera outside of the reef maybe has not been spotted, but is there. But sometimes by reviewing the literature, you can find that a specific genus is occurring alongside, a patch of corals or some little reefs. So, yeah, it's not surprising.
Thank you. Then we have another question by Alayo, if I pronounce it correctly, asking, your brachiopods with clasping spines in the Caucasian reefs are very similar to the clasping spines of the modern oyster Lophorpholium. But in that case, they are an ecophenotypic morphology.
Yeah, the clasping spines. Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I should say that the clasping spines are very interesting because I didn't say that, but many brachiopods actually show, or we think they had clasping spines, maybe in the early growth stages. So this kind of mode of attachment can be common in a lot of productids, at least during their youth stages, but is uncommon for these brachiopods to remain attached like that during adult growth stages. So the peculiarity of the brachiopods in these reefs is that they remain attached, such as this beautiful example here of Cinematella, to the stems of the crinoids, to the corals, also after the youth stage. So by developing very large, stout clasping spines and not by just having little juvenile spines.
All right. In that sense, I have another kind of related question about ontogeny. Do you see any differences in specific life stages of brachiopods, where in one stage they live in certain areas of the reefs and in others they live somewhere else?
You mean if some areas have more juveniles than in other areas?
Yeah.
Actually, no, I've no data regarding this. I would say that not really. Most of the brachiopods, they seem to be more or less adult, I would say. There is no side sorting either due to current winnowing or to specific events of mortality. I think this is an indication of an environment which was quite stable. So these brachiopods were mostly able to reach adulthood and their full dimension. Even if I should say that the way, is working in these environments, in the reefs and in the mud mounds on the field, can be tricky because it's very difficult to extract brachiopods from the limestone. It's not like working on shale, sandstone, and other kind of lithologies. So the rock should be destroyed completely by hammering. So I should say that usually the paleontologist working on this succession will take out the big specimens, and the presence of very small juveniles maybe will be overlooked. During my PhD on the mud mounds, I just took basically adult specimens, but then you can see in the thin sections also the presence of some juveniles. Of course, it's difficult to, at this point, do a quantitative comparison between the mesoscale collection and what you see in thin section. But I should say that no, there is not a specific amount of juveniles.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Let's see. We got a few anonymous questions, so I will just paste those in the chat right now. The first one asks, does the preservation potential of brachiopod shells differ across different reef types? And does this introduce a bias?
No, sorry, I didn't understand.
Does the preservation potential, so diagenetic potential of the brachiopod shells differ across different reef types, where they assume they mean like the mud mound versus the skeletal settings that you
Oh,
discussed?
yeah, I see. No, I don't think that has an influence with respect to the fact that I'm talking just about carbonate reefs, and in carbonate rocks, the preservation potential of brachiopods, which has a low magnesium calcite brachiopods, is always very high. It's not like for bivalves where you have aragonitic species in general, which will be less preserved than calcitic bivalves. So I don't think that has any influence. Brachiopods in reefs are preserved mostly. I think that the problem can be another one. The problem is the problem of the amount of studies. For example, now I'm doing my postdoc in China. I'm also working on Carboniferous and Permian successions in China. And for what I know now, for what I've seen and from the literature, I cannot find anything like that, any reef specialized fauna of this kind in Chinese reef. So now my question is this because there is no, or is this because no one noticed? Because it's very easy to overlook details like the cicatrix, like the presence of such spines, to just say this is a productus of some kind, and so not to recognize this kind of this kind of faunas. That's why I'm saying that a very careful taxonomic work on each fossil group is always needed, if possible, because the data are all there, especially in carbonate environments with low calcitic magnesium shells. The data are all there, but they should be studied.
Thank you. So I guess still more work to do in
yeah, a lot.
reefs. Let's see. Oh, and Andre, I think it's Andre. Sorry. Says thanks for the answer. It's not Andre. I'm sorry. We have another anonymous question asking, can the brachiopod assemblage in reefs tell us something about environmental conditions within that reef?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, a very prominent example, which I think is indicative, is from the mud mounts of my PhD. So I've shown you this graph, and this graph shows that there is a predominance in terms of biovolume of the productides, which are the concavo-convex spinose brachiopods. So this means that they are more abundant in several specimens, but also that they were reaching the higher dimensions. They were larger than any other kind of brachiopods. So these brachiopods have a very specific lophophore morphology, which is different from other kind of brachiopod orders, which we think was adapted to environments of sparse and scattered food resources. So the dominance of productides, for example, in mud mounds, is interpreted in our papers as indicating an environment with scattered food resources, not completely oligotrophic, because of course the community is much structured with bryozoans and crinoids and a lot of brachiopods, but still it was not a eutrophic setting. And in fact, the microbial community was not thriving. So it was a mesotrophic environment, and we can say that also by studying the dominance of the different groups of brachiopods. And of course, also in the reef, the dominance of also regarding the substrate, the dominance of certain kinds of brachiopods adapted to the hard substrate, or the dominance of certain brachiopods adapted to muddy soft substrates, can reveal and can sustain the sedimentological analysis on revealing what kind of substrate was there during the deposition of the reef, because sometimes the sedimentological analysis can be misleading with the micrite types. And so by saying we have more pedicle-attached brachiopods, which are adapted to mixed substrate, or more concavo-convex spinose brachiopods, which are adapted to soft substrate, we can say the environment was more muddy, or was more firm, was more hard. So yeah, we can say a lot of brachiopods.
Thank you. We have one more anonymous question. So for the audience, if you still have any questions, please type them out in the chat now. This one asks, how about the role of modern brachiopods in reef environments? Is it similar to the Pennsylvanian to Permian style, or have bivalves perhaps taken over this niche?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, I should admit I don't know much of anything happening out after the Permian because I mostly work in the Palaezoic. But as a brachiopod guy, I mean, of course, I don't want to insult people working on modern brachiopods, which are very interesting, but the world of Mesozoic and Cenozoic brachiopods is less diverse. There are less orders, and also from a morphological point of view, there are less variation. So, for example, the Productides, which is the group I mostly work on, which are the ones showing the most strange and weird specialization and specialized morphology in reef, do not occur in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. So in modern reefs, there are brachiopods, of course, because brachiopods now mostly occur in cryptic environments, such as the cavities of reefs, but they mostly are biconvex brachiopods attaching through a pedicle or sometimes directly with their umbo to the hard substrate. But they are, in a way, they have a less specialized morphology, which doesn't mean they're not very well adapted to their environment, of course. But they are not these aberrant forms which we have in the Palaeozoic reefs.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hope there's no modern brachiopods workers in the audience.
No, I know there is one.
But you're right, of course, it's just less diverse. I'm gonna give the audience a few more seconds to type in any last-minute questions, but of course, if you have a specific question, you can also ask it during the tea time. I would already like to thank you again, Alessandro, for your great talk and answering all the questions. I also want to thank the audience for asking so many interesting questions. And seeing that there's no more questions right now, I will just briefly share some updates about next week's talk before we go into the tea time. So yeah, thanks again everyone for joining us. I hope to see you next week, actually, if you want to join. So next week we have a talk about micropaleontology by Helena Barzia from the UK. More details on that will follow. It's the usual time. I would also like to stress that if you would kindly fill out the Wiki feedback form, it would be greatly appreciated. So to those of you that won't stay for tea time, I hope to see you next week. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day or evening.